Hey, this is Mark Matlock, and I am here with Andy Root, and I am really excited about this aspect of my job, is that I get to talk to some of the YS authors and just people in the youth ministry world that are thinking about things, doing things in just amazing ways, trying to help all of us in youth ministry be more effective in what we're trying to do, and even defining what youth ministry is, which is, I think, something that a lot of us are starting to really wrestle with in a very deep way. And it's been my privilege just to get to know Andy over the years. And so, Andy, I want to welcome you today to our little Skype chat.
Thanks, man. It's great to be here.
And Andy has written 2 books that I think are probably going to be those books that everybody puts on their shelf. And they're the first 2 of a series of 4. And so I'm kind of bragging a little about you here, Andy. So I know you got to sit here and endure it. But the first book is Taking Theology to Youth Ministry, and the second is Taking the Cross to Youth Ministry. And these are the first 2 in a 4-part series that you kind of call the Chronicles of Nadia.
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah.
And they say you can't judge a book by the cover, but I want to tell you these are really cool covers. And I'm a bit of a book geek, and I just love the feel of books. I like to sleep with books under my pillow. And just the size, they're hardback, they feel really good, just as objects, just as furniture for the house. But tell me a little bit about why you wanted to write these 4 books, and then talk a little about the way that you wrote them, because they're really different.
Yeah, they are different. And you're right, Mark. The books are way cooler cover-wise and to touch than I am. So that's the first thing that you feel good about. Like, the books look way cooler than I actually am. So that's a good start, at least for me. Yeah, I mean, the idea of these books were, I don't know, it was a crazy idea that I talked about with Jay Halver at one point while he was still kind of mediating between YS and Zondervan, and that we were having a steak together at one of the conventions, and I said, I have this idea of this kind of this pseudo, and this sounds really obscure, but the pseudo kind of systematic theology for youth ministry, which he looked at me like I was crazy with that idea. But just looking at some larger theological themes through the on-the-ground youth worker and how these kind of pop up and how they define you and how you wrestle with them. And I thought I was just making conversation. And then a week later he called me and said, yeah, I think I want to do that project. And then I was like, oh, okay, how do I actually do this? And so I knew
We've all had those moments where we've thrown out the idea, and then it's like, oh man, I got to actually pull this off now.
Right, yeah. Exactly. Like, okay, I think I can do this. I don't know what this is going to look like. But I knew I wanted to a lot of my work has been more at the academic level, and has been trying to push an academic conversation and really push academics and academic theologians to take youth ministry seriously and to see it as a location to do really deep theological reflection. But this series I wanted to do kind of from the bottom up, basically because of my love for youth workers and what they do. And so, I'm not a prolific writer in the sense of I'm not working on the next great American novel, let me tell you that. But I decided what I wanted to do was kind of write these through a narrative, like to create a youth worker who I imagined in my mind really loved my work and, would always go to my workshops at the convention. I had all these weird thoughts of who this person was. So I came up with this youth worker named Nadia, and basically took together some of my students' experiences on the ground in youth ministry, some of my own experiences when I worked for Young Life and worked in congregations, and kind of created scenarios that had happened to us and put them within the framework of this one young woman named Nadia and how it leads her on this theological journey. I mean, that she's kind of comes up against these big questions. Like in book 1, she has to figure out, not because she's in this kind of intellectual place, but basically because she's in ministry and she has to have her first review at her first, after her first year in ministry. And basically they ask her, so what's youth ministry for? Like, what's the point of it? And she's had some experience with some parents and some experiences with her young people that lead her to have to actually think, like, what do I think I'm doing here? What's the point of what I'm doing here? So they're a theological series, but all hopefully with this kind of fleshy experience of someone on the ground. And I think most youth workers will recognize themselves in Nadia. She's not an academic. She's, in my mind, she's taken a handful of seminary classes and really didn't like it. I mean, she found it to be kind of obscure, and she wasn't really into parsing Hebrew words. She wanted to really do ministry, but in doing ministry was kind of pushed into deep questions about who is God, who are these young people, what am I doing when I'm spending my life in the context of the church, in the context of ministry with young people.
Well, I really, when I first started reading I thought it was really interesting that you made your protagonist, Nadia, a female. And that was, for me at first I thought, oh, am I going to relate to her, or are there going to be, different kind of issues that she deals with the female aspect of working in a church environment that typically is dominated all male. But boy, you really wrote her really well. And I was sitting there, just reading going, wow, I saw myself in moments that I still hadn't quite come to resolve in my own ministry in her. And then I just thought about all the, thousands of youth workers that I've met over the 2 decades of youth ministry that I've sat down over a meal with, and them pouring out their hearts with, what they're struggling with and the things that aren't working. And I thought, and you really captured all of those things in her, the tensions of dealing with parents' expectations, student expectations. There's this one great moment where a parent comes in and says to Nadia, hey, my daughter, isn't going to the youth group. I asked her why, and she said it's boring. But she's going to this other church down the street. And the way that she reacted to that and where it led her, I think it's something that a lot of us have experienced at one time or another.
Yeah.
And you're taking something that's very abstract in some sense for a lot of people, theology, and you're really through the story making it concrete.
Yeah. And that's an experience I actually have had quite often when I'll go into churches and do, say, an adult forum on youth ministry with parents. It's almost consistently, I'll have a parent come up to me after and kind of want me to be their advocate and get into my face and say, you know what, at this church, I'm just so angry at Billy, the youth pastor. I'm just so angry. I'm just so mad at him. He's just failing this church. He's failing. And then you ask, well, what's going on? It sounds like he's selling drugs in the basement, or they're just irate. And that's often the issue. Well, my daughter just doesn't like it. My daughter just doesn't like coming here. And you know what's worse? She'll go to the whatever different denomination it is down the street. And it often is this kind of, the youth workers is thrown under the bus because it's perceived that his or her job is to keep the kid good or keep the kid affiliated to the church in the vein of the church that the parent has a certain connection to. They're Presbyterian, so they want their kid to like the Presbyterian church. God forsake, they like the Baptist church more. And so they end up getting really mad at the youth worker because they're not meeting the need that they think needs to be met. And you can see how as a youth worker you can get pulled in so many directions. Your kids don't like this. You go and hear a great seminar somewhere else and you get pulled in this direction, and then you have a parent that pulls you in this direction. So that first book is really asking this question, like, what is youth ministry for? Like, what's the point of it? What sets the terms for what we do? And I do try to make an argument that it's that the answer to that is theological, and it's this idea that in my perspective, which I try to articulate in the first half of the book, is that what youth ministry is for is participating in the action of God. There's got to be something about who is this God and how is this God moving in the world that sets the terms for our action. And probably most people listening are like, oh yeah, of course it is. But it really is amazing within youth ministry how we've been pushed away from that focus, and that we usually feel like, well, what youth ministry is really for, these external pressures are to keep kids good. Or usually in more conservative Protestant communities, it's like, keep my kid good. That's what I want you to do. Make sure they don't end up on drugs or have sex, and that this is what you're for. And there's part of that's definitely true. But if that's the sole thing, then you're more of a moral police officer than anything else. And in a lot of mainline congregations and churches, the objective is really to make more of whatever denominational affiliates there are. So it's they look around at Methodist and Lutheran churches and think, oh my gosh, there's no one coming anymore. We're dropping, 14% of our membership a year. What we need is more young Lutherans or more young Methodists. So we hire a youth pastor, a youth worker to make more of those affiliates. And that, I think that just leads to an incredible amount of burnout, and is fundamentally, to me, not a distinctly theological focus. It doesn't ask this question, who is God and what is God leading us to? So the whole series really tries to articulate what would it be like through this woman who has this kind of awakening if we framed youth ministry really as participating in the action of God, which leads us to have to ask really big questions like, well, how does God act? And how does God act particularly with 15-year-olds or 14-year-olds or 18-year-olds? How do we get our mind around that? And how do we even explain that to young people? And I do think that there's ways, and this is why I use this kind of narrative, is I try to show in the series how thinking theologically becomes formative. And I think throughout the series of this book, Nadia has changed, not because she gets a degree, but because she enters into this kind of reflective process of who is this God and how do I encounter this God? And it happens, in the second book, it really happens through, she has to give a talk at a camp, at a weekend camp, and she's got to talk about the cross. And so what is the cross? And how do I talk about the cross with these young people here? And then in the books that will come out before the end of the year, it's doing a Bible study and asking, well, what is the Bible anyhow? And then the final book, it's on a mission trip and asking, what are we doing here? And how is God involved in this? Is this just a kind of an immersion experience for our kids to feel like they've done something good and pat themselves on the back, like we spent a week with people who are in poverty? Or is God really up to something here? And how do you deal with that? I mean, how do you deal with it when you take kids, they spend a week immersed in a incredibly poverty-stricken neighborhood or village, and then on the way home you stop at Disneyland for a week, or at least right before you cross the border,
it's like worldview whiplash.
Yeah, exactly. And why do we do? Why do we do that? And so to kind of think.
When I was in high school, we went to Haiti, and then went to Disney World on the way home.
Yeah,
and it was just like, it was mind bending trying to understand that, and it was almost like this, like it was a whiteboard that just wiped away everything we learned or whatever. And yeah,
we did the same thing. A mission trip I went on when I was a kid, my senior in high school. I'll never forget spending all week in this really difficult, poverty-stricken neighborhood in Trinidad, and then spending the last 2 days on Tobago as tourists sipping, virgin cocktails and swimming in the ocean and eating shark sandwiches. And it was like this total immersion into deep suffering and then tourism, like all kind of combined into one. And so those are things all youth workers have to confront. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to plan your mission trip? And I guess the theological turn really is just to ask, well, how do you make sense of where God is in the midst of that? I mean, it may be a great experience for your kids, and it may give them loyalty to the church, but how do they encounter the actual being of God in the midst of that? And so that's kind of the hope of the series, is through this person to help youth workers actually see theology can be quite practical in many ways.
Yeah, I think this is a great series, and I can't wait to talk to you more about the other books, but just want anybody who's watching, A Theological Journey Through Youth Ministry is the name of the series. Taking the Cross to Youth Ministry and Taking Theology to Youth Ministry are the books, and these are books that I think are going to be life changers for a lot of people, and really get people thinking in different ways. So I can't thank you enough for taking the time and writing these and doing such a great job thinking outside of the box with how you did that.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Andy, for being with us today.